So let's talk through the very strongest armies in Warhammer 40k with a look at the top 10 best armies in the game right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the top of the 40k meta, talk through in order what are looking like the top 10 40k armies at the moment and what's making them so good currently. Broadly at the moment in Warhammer 40k, I would say that game balance is in a much better state than it's often been in the past, certainly better than the majority of 9th edition until Games Workshop got their acts together towards the end of it, and just astronomically ridiculously better than it was towards the start of 10th, with certain factions like Aeldari and Genestealer Cult having ridiculously big win percentages, and Votann and Death Guard really struggling comparatively. Obviously there's always room for improvement and either making things even more balanced between factions, as there are definitely still some lower performers and some things bucking the meta, and making factions more interesting by rebalancing their units internally. But overall I feel like they're really not doing a bad job compared with how 40k has been for most of its existence. Today though we're focusing on the very top armies in 40k, and there's plenty of different ways that you can look at them in the statistics and things. In general I like to go through the list in terms of tournament win percentage. Quite a nice rough and ready measure for how well the faction's doing against games. If you win more games, then in general you're being stronger as an army. It's not the 100% be all and end all, as it definitely matters what sort of players are playing each faction, and you might have certain armies that perhaps stomp the majority of the field but can't beat the best armies in the game, or just have terrible matchups against certain factions, but I think it's a pretty reasonable way for a general overview. Otherwise, I think it's also worth looking at wins at big events. That shows the armies that are actually winning tournaments and are doing the best at the very highest levels of play. And also the faction play rate as well, how many times people are choosing the factions in 40k. Obviously this one's heavily dependent on how many people collect the army to start with, but you definitely get more people playing factions when they're strong than when they're super weak. 40k's next balance update is expected around January sometime. I wouldn't be expecting anything else major to change before Christmas on this list really, though definitely we'll be looking at some of the top armies here and expecting Games Workshop to tweak them in one way or another. Certainly the armies around the 55% win percentage definitely look like they're in the danger zone by Games Workshop's normal methodology. In any case, let's jump right into it. And before we go through the top 10 proper, I thought it was just worth talking about the more middle tier of Warhammer 40k. These are armies between 47 and 49% win percentage. It seems that the top 10 at the moment are all 50 or above. Here we've got the Sisters of Battle, Space Wolves Death Watch, and Dark Angels of the Space Marine Divergent chapters, Chaos Demons, Death Guard, Tyranids, and Admech. I'd say that the majority of these armies are kind of good with the right list, but maybe a bit more limited in their options than most armies out there. For example, Admech needing to rely on Cataphron spam to get things done, Space Wolves heavily going in for Thunder Wolves, and Sisters lists maybe feel a bit unusual at the moment, having to go in for heavy armour quite a bit. In general, for the most part though, I'd say they're probably in a good spot power-wise for Warhammer 40k. Perhaps could just do with a bit more internal balance within their codexes for a few of these guys, perhaps some boosts to some of their weakest units to help incentivize you to take them, versus the strong stuff that does tend to work and might punch up a bit against the top guys. Getting into the top 10 proper though, and in 10th place we have Genestealer Cults. They're winning around about 50% of games at the moment, so half and half, though perhaps partly due to just not really being taken all that many times by tournament players these days. They've only taken down 2 big events since the balanced data slate. Being the 22nd most played of the 26 factions though, that's definitely having a big factor in that. Their actual big wins per the amount of times they're played isn't actually too bad with those numbers. For stronger units out of the Genestealer Cults, in general most lists tend to build heavily around Acolytes with demo charges and Neophyte Bricks with seismic cannons, maybe with a Primus or Nexos to lead them, with big rerolls and free damage dealing stratagems, plus focal buffs that the Genestealer Cults can do with cult ambush things and stratagems. Aberrants with an infiltrating character of some sort are very scary to start up the board. The Achilles Ridge Runner, maybe with mortars, are quite nice for marking targets. They make the other units get extra AP against the things that they're shooting. And out of their other supporting cast of characters, perhaps the Reductor Saboteur really stands out as being particularly nasty. Lone Operatives are just generally kind of handy to have on the board, and coming with some fairly general purpose threat of 4 different flavours of explosives is definitely a big win. Genestealer Cults are definitely quite spooky to play. Cult Ambush meaning that often unit kills might just come straight back to haunt you via their blip token redeployment. They could crop up at all sorts of places on the board with stratagems like Return to Reserve easily, units dropping just outside of 3 inches of enemies to hit things that otherwise would have been screened safe, a nice hide from shooting one, and a few really big damage dealing stratagems with things like +1 to wounds and extra ballistic skill and AP on offer. Otherwise though, perhaps a fair few of the other units in the codex do feel a lot more mid now, maybe being taken in small numbers to support if at all. And other weaknesses of the faction might be deep strikers and fast movers to remove tokens, things like Inceptors could be quite nasty for that. And in the data they seem to perform fairly poorly against melee rush type armies, things like Orks on rushing against them seem to do quite well. Having big swings as to whether things respawn or not isn't the best as well, sometimes can be big and positive, but often could just have the dice betray you and deny you a whole load of reinforcements that you might have been odds on to get. It seems that despite the rather enormous nerfs that the cult got with their respawns and the points cost towards the start of September though, they're still doing pretty well in game and can still be a massive threat. Next up we've got the Thousand Sons joining them on around about a 50% win rate. They've had 3 tournament wins since the balanced data slate, though at least compared with the Genestealer Cult that's probably reflective of more people playing them. They're the 13th most played army of the 26 factions counted here. In general, for unit choices, the Thousand Sons I don't feel like are in the worst spot, at least the iconic units that might draw you to play the faction are really quite good. Magnus himself tends to be the psychic damage linchpin of most army lists, and poses an enormous threat himself and is a nice focal point of stratagems and cabalistic rituals. Rubric Marines tend to be taken en masse to accompany the various flavours of Sorcerer, both 5-man squads and 10-man squads are playable, and they can be really quite nasty damage dealing with Warp Flamers, maybe teleported around the board with the Umbrellific Crystal. Games Workshop seem to have done quite well with balancing the various flavours of Sorcerer. I'd argue that literally all of them are usable depending on exactly what you want out of them. And the Scarab Occult Terminators and the Mutolith Vortex Beast maybe feel a little bit less essential, but definitely very strong if you want to run them. I think they remain an army with a very strong core mechanic as well in those cabalistic rituals. You maybe do have to build around it really quite a lot to make the most out of them, hence all the small Rubric Marine squads and sorcerers and things. But they really do give you some very cool abilities, stripping saves from one model to near guarantee its death, double moving things, and the big mortal wounds of Doombolt are very nice too. For weaknesses, they do tend to run really quite character heavy compared with most armies out there, between that Magnus and slightly more expensive Rubric Marines than before. I'd argue they perhaps aren't the most durable army when taken as a whole, and do need to focus on hiding a bit and inflicting damage when they need to. They can be a little bit slow outside of teleports and movement shenanigans and things, and as mentioned, army lists are maybe a little bit restrictive around the things that generate the Cabal points. Most of their motor pool outside of the odd Rhino or so doesn't tend to be taken too much, and even things like Cultists and Zangors are kind of taken in small numbers compared with the rubrics. They're definitely remaining a very scary army with a whole ton of options open to them though. Kind of nice to have them still strong enough, but maybe dependent on a lot of clever schemes coming together. Their core mechanic I think does represent the machinations of Tzeentch rather nicely. Next up and joining them on 50% wins are the Tau Empire. These guys have actually come down a little bit on tournament win rate since I last looked at them. Maybe people starting to figure out how to handle their tricks a bit more. They're still doing great in tournament performance though, 6 big tournament wins since the balanced data slate, though again I'd say that puts them kind of on par with Thousand Sons and Genestealer Cults. They are just played far more, the 6th most popular faction out of 26. Tau I feel like one of the armies that Games Workshop have done pretty well to make just about every unit in the codex pretty interesting. There's far more interesting and usable stuff than stuff that's just not worth it. Crisis suits with cyclic ion blasters tend to be a staple in almost every list, often joined by the Crisis Commander with the early Kauyon upgrade, or maybe Farsight perhaps. Other direct damage dealer options include broadsides, hammerheads, skyrays, and riptides. The riptide maybe being the most different out of those, as it's more durability than damage. Piranhas are nice interference units with some seeker missiles. Tetras are excellent for their big hit rerolls, and again are almost auto-include if you've got some. A ghost kill or two are quite nice for lone operative shooting. Farsight and Shadowsun are both really strong, and they've got some nice options for interference units like Kroot, Hound, Stealth Suits, or Vespids. Even the standard Fire Warriors, Breachers, Devilfish, and Fireblades and Ethereals are all kind of usable as well. Nice to have those a bit more relevant than they have been in the past. I would say that Tau Empire maybe don't have the most enormously strong supporting rules ever. Their core ability is to work in pairs to get squads hitting on a 3+, potentially with other buffs like Stealth Suits or the Tetras. That is kind of nice, but maybe it's just trying to get your damage dealing units to where they kind of need to be really. Otherwise that early Kauyon enhancement is very nice on a Crisis Commander, and maybe the jump shoot jump might be one of the most relevant out of the stratagems. Nice to have Crisis Suits pop up, shoot something, and then hide safe again. For weaknesses, as ever, Tau don't generally want the enemy too close to them and giving and receiving damage all that much. They don't really have any serious melee units bar Farsight, and they have somewhat low durability, even if you build maximally for it with crisis suits and shield generators and things. Even maximal durability units are kind of spendy. For that reason, I feel like they're an army that tends to do a bit better in the hands of people who are really experienced with them than newer players, more so than other factions, as there's a bit of a need to balance keeping your damage dealers safe and not just throwing them up the board where they can get killed. But at the same time, if you hang too far back and play too conservatively, then you might just not score enough points in the early game to catch up later. Crisis suits, while being one of the best damage dealers as well, do have the issue of also damaging themselves pretty hard as well. Can be an issue if you have some particularly brutal hazardous rolls with them. Overall though, I'd say that Tower are in really quite a good spot. Having good arguments for most of the units in their index is rather nice, plus their win percentage feels very balanced at an even 50. Next up, we've got the Infernal Engines of the Chaos Knights, winning around about 51% of tournament games. Looks like they've taken down 4 big events since the balanced data slate, and they are again a fairly popular faction, 10th most played out of the 26. Solid enough numbers all around, and looking far ahead than their Imperial cousins at the moment. The Imperials have been faltering on the sort of 45%-ish mark since the data slate changes. For their stronger units, the Chaos Knights still definitely tend to run more War Dog heavy than the Imperials. There might have been a little bit of a swing towards having at least some big knights in the army following the latest points changes, but I'd still say it'd be uncommon for a list to have more points in Titanic Knights than War Dogs, and plenty of lists run nothing but War Dog spam. Out of those, the Brigands remain excellent gun turrets with their anti-infantry and anti-tank shooting. Carnivores went from kind of okay to absolutely great with their 140 point cost for a cheap and utterly ferocious melee knight, and Stalkers are a nice halfway with a bit of melee and a bit of range threat. Out of the big ones, my first choices would be between the Rampager, Desecrator and Despoiler. The Rampager is particularly nice after the points cut that it got, and it does bring some absolutely enormous melee at fairly cheap. For their other supporting rules, I feel like the -1 AP enhancement is rather nice, often going to be relevant and particularly on a big knight that gets itself caught up in combat. And they've got some interesting stratagem support like Terror Shades to double down on their battle shock tricks, options to walk through walls which are perhaps more relevant now that Rampagers and Carnivores are even bigger as things. And for a few nuisance units to do secondaries and things, they can ally in some demons for support. Probably Nurglings, Infiltrating or Deep Striking will be maybe my first choice there, though you could consider these Tzeentch lone operatives as well, perhaps. For weaknesses, knights are always going to have some obvious ones. They don't get on amazingly well with heavy terrain, having to go around it being vehicles, or at least if you're not paying command points for it with the walk-through walls. Any armies that go very heavy on anti-tank or have easy access to excellent anti-tank is not going to be great. Aeldari are perhaps a good example of that, which isn't great news when lots of people are running them and they're incredibly strong. And their core morale shenanigans, which I think admittedly are strong enough to do important things throughout the game, can just be very random. For any given important battle shock test, your opponent might just pass it, and the damage buffs that it brings come a little bit late on in the game from round 3 onwards, by which point in some games the battle might be getting on for being decided already. Despite a few issues though, it does look like it's a good time to be a Spiky Knight pilot, a bit of a table turnaround from the start of the edition when it was Imperials all the way. In 6th place on the list, we have the World Eaters. They're winning around about 52% of games. Plenty of skulls for Khorne taken there. They're a fairly niche faction without the biggest following at the moment, as they're kind of new. They're 19th most played of the 26 armies out there, and have only taken down the 1 grand tournament so far. Anthony Vanella managing that the other week. World Eaters don't exactly have the biggest unique unit roster at the moment, and I'd argue that most are usable, though certainly Angron is massively standout and basically auto-include in most lists at the moment. Ridiculously scary melee with fairly easy turn 1 charges, unless the dice on the Blessings of Khorne go super cold, and the absolute game-changing ability to turn up again if you manage to roll high on the favour of Khorne. Returning over 400 points of model to the board is absolutely ridiculous. Otherwise, both types of 8-bound are very destructive. They can both scout really quite far forwards with Lord Invocatus nearby. Berserkers and Rhinos are rather nice, accompanied by the Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive quite a bit. Lots of lists like to run a Juggernaut Lord with the Favour of Khorne enhancements to give you every chance to get the right blessings when you need them and revive Angron as well. Plus maybe a few supporting objective grabbers, things like Jackals or Spawn. The Blessing table is really quite fun, and you can change it up a bit later in the game for just adding in extra damage or defense as needed if the movement isn't as critical. There's some nice enough stratagems, and the Favour of Khorne and the Berserker Glaive are quite nice out of the enhancements, maybe the best of them. Perhaps for weaknesses, given that they're World Eaters, they're probably not going to be the most creative of armies. They are going to rush at you screaming with chain axes, but I guess they wouldn't have it any other way. It does mean that they maybe have a bit of a lack of really good units to fill other battlefield roles, even their objective scoring chaff is a little bit on the pricey side. Seems that just in general from tournament statistics and things, they seem to be quite good at winning games, but less so at winning events. Could just be kind of down to bad luck though, given that it's always a little bit random whether or not someone takes the top spot or just falls short, but I guess could be an indication that maybe the best players out there know how to handle them with what they're going to try and do to you. In any case, Khorne shall be pleased with the World Eaters at the moment, spilling plenty of blood from just about any other army in the game that faces them, and definitely living up to being some of the very best shock troopers in the galaxy. Perhaps rivaling them for that crown though are the Orks. They seem to be around the same sort of win percentage as the World Eaters at 52% with their own flavour of shock melee, and are quite a lot more of a popular faction at the moment, being 8th most played of 26, definitely one of the more popular factions in 40k just in general though, and have so far taken 8 big tournament first place finishes since the data slates. In general for Orks at the moment it tends to be very melee focused, usually at least a few trucks delivering melee damage dealers into the enemy lines, maybe knobs or beast snagger boys led by war bosses or beast bosses perhaps. Mega knobs and regular boys are fairly playable as well, and alongside them are usually found a whole bunch of squighog boys, maybe backed up by a knob with a smasher squig, or the squigosaur bosses or Mosrog Scragbat. The smasher squig knob is quite a nice one for Ed Whopper's kill chopper. That combos really quite nicely between the anti-monsters and vehicles and devastating wounds. A few units of absolutely dirt cheap Gretchen seem almost auto-include, rustling you up command points, and also being just kind of handy to have lots of objective control bodies, even if they're not too hard to kill. Captain Badrock plus Flash Gits are really quite dangerous and could be another good choice for going in a truck, and Storm Boys are pretty nice for secondary objectives, deep striking down to score points, or just moving very quickly across the board. The Orc War Tribe detachment definitely incentivises melee over other things, with most of the stratagems revolving around that, and the turn where you call the war is really quite a brutal one, invulnerable saves, extra strength attacks, and advance and charge. Out of the other stratagems, maybe the -1 to wound one is quite nice as well, a little bit of pop-up durability where needed. As for weaknesses, they do tend to have quite a lot of units that maybe punch with a sort of middling sort of strength, and don't have a whole load of things that have enormously high strength and high damage characteristics that you might want to take down, say, toughness 10+ vehicles. Perhaps like the World Eaters as well, they do tend to be a little bit mono-build in really wanting to go for melee rush orc units, and a lot of the rest of the units are just kind of overcosted throughout the index. Things like the buggies and walkers and planes and things could all do with going down in cost a bit if they wanted to rival the good melee stuff. I guess that might partly be just due to having detachment rules that don't really support the DACA units that much. Maybe that might be something that gets added when they get their codex in spring. In any case, always still fun to see Violent Orcs doing rather well in the tournament standings. They're definitely a fun and dynamic army to play with a lot of onrushing melee. Ranking in 4th place by a win percent are the Leagues of Votann, with wins of 54% so far, really quite a big turnaround from being arguably the weakest faction in all of 40k when 10th edition started. The huge points cuts combined with making 4 different enemy units plus 1 to hit and wound with the judgment tokens really has increased their prospects. Otherwise, it looks like they've taken down 5 big events so far since the balanced data slate. Fairly impressive given that they're still a somewhat niche faction in terms of play rate, maybe similar to the World Eaters as a fairly new army that aren't just all that many established collectors for them yet. Looks like they're being played 17th most out of the 26 factions right now. The Leagues of Votann only have a very small index, though I'd say that most of it is really quite interesting. Most competitive lists tend to make very heavy use of the scouting Sagittars that have just very scary firepower in their own right, never mind their transport duties. Ironhair Hearthguard tend to be a staple and are one of the more efficient units, and things like the Hexon Land Fortress are good, the Thunderkin with the Grav Cannons, and basically most of the characters besides Uthar the Destined. That big damage buff at the start of the game has made a massive difference to them, just handing out 4 big judgment token buffs to 4 different enemy units. Against the majority of the list, that is going to cover a whole load of important stuff. And I feel like as stratagem sections go out of the indexes, they've got a pretty good one with lots of very nice options. Maybe the sustained hits one for targets that have judgment tokens is perhaps particularly impressive. Otherwise, for weaknesses, they do tend to be a little bit on the short range side. Some of their units are a little bit slow, though Sagittars or things teleporting into place won't care about that. I'd say that they perhaps have not that much in the way of cheap expendable units with things to do with secondaries or sit on primaries for very low investments. Hearthkin definitely don't feel like they're one of the stars of the index at the moment. You could maybe take a squad or two, but lots of lists choose to leave them out completely or only take one unit. Still though, looks like Games Workshop's cloned dwarves are doing rather well right now. Massive amounts of close range shooting strength, and definitely a force to be reckoned with all their vehicles. Ranking in third place by win percentage, we have the Black Templars next, around about 55% win rate since the balanced data slate, and perhaps kind of similar to the leagues of Votann with the other statistics, 4 big tournament wins so far, and around the same sort of player rate, a little bit on the niche side, 18th most played out of the 26. As Space Marine players go, they do have a following, but maybe just not quite as much as some of the other Divergent chapters. I think it's kind of not surprising to see them quite so crazily ahead of all of the other Divergent chapter competition right now, though. The vast majority of their unique choices are really quite usable, and they've got an okay launch detachment as well, and I think could easily be argued to be perhaps the strongest Space Marine chapter choice for a lot of the new detachments in their codex. Big Crusader squads are really quite efficient, surprisingly cheap Marine stat lines, lots of objective control, and good leaders on offer in Grimaldus for the 5+ Feel No Pain, or Helbrex for some raw might. The vehicles with their cheap multi-melters are pretty excellent in the Ironstorm Spearhead. Things like Gladiator tanks or repulsors are just extra strong for Black Templars, where you're paying very minimal points for an extra 2 big armor-busting shots. And otherwise, Sword Brethren are playable with some big melee damage, and cheap Firstborn Crusader squads in 5 men with las cannons are just a very nice, efficient, and pretty tough unit for 65 points, while still packing some big anti-tank. On top of all that, they can take their pick out of the other units in the Space Marine Codex: Redemptor Dreadnoughts, Gladiator Lancers, Inceptors for scoring, and cheap screening scouts, and there's plenty more on offer. For supporting rules, they seem to do quite well in Ironstorm Spearhead, with pretty much flatly superior vehicles. They work well in Gladius or Vanguard, which makes good use of their melee infantry units, and their Index Righteous Crusaders is good as well. A 6+ Feel No Pain army wide is fine, and plenty of nice melee support stratagems, and they can take that Tannhauser's Bone Relic for the 5+ Feel No Pain or an extra unit. Overall, putting that all together, they're a chapter that can be very strong in a lot of different ways, going big melee hordes with leaders, or just going very tank heavy and playing Ironstorm, and anything in between. Overall, as Space Marines go, they do seem to do quite well. Perhaps the Crusader squad builds might just struggle a little bit more than they did before now the old Oath of Moment has gone with the full reroll wound rolls. I think that was particularly helpful for them at making them a bit more general purpose damage threats, given that they just pack a lot of chainsword attacks. Not really too much to say on the weakness side of things though, as with this kind of tournament performance, they are one of the strongest factions in the game right now. Next up, and for the Dark Gods, we have the Chaos Space Marines. They're winning around about the same sort of games win rate wise at a big 55%, but they do seem to be taking home a ridiculous amount of tournaments at the moment. 15 big wins since the balanced data slate came out, and are a very popular faction, 5th most played out of the 26. Basically, for armies that you might expect to win any given tournament, the most likely bets are easily these guys or the Aeldari. For stronger units, the Chaos Space Marines are often all about big synergy and stratagems with their various dark pacts, and the marks that you choose giving you some seriously big power buffs depending on which one and which stratagems they can access. For staples in the army at the moment, Chosen in Rhinos backed up by Chaos Lords are pretty terrifying for the cost. Between undivided big reroll stratagems and the Chaos Lord damage buffs, they're just units that can murder a huge amount of the enemy force for how much they cost. Plus they can be in Rhinos that have the mark of Nurgle, allowing them to access the higher form of the stratagem that prevents them from being shot at greater than 12-inch range. Very scary. Obliterators and Forge Fiends tend to do the majority of the range damage dealing. Deep striking Obliterators with either mark of Nurgle or undivided, and the same for Forge Fiends in the backfield, bringing some devastating wound goodness. And the triple blast that they have means that they can be quite good even against big ranked up infantry units, as well as just toughness 10 tanks or something. Abaddon is really quite threatening with his big hit rerolls and works great with the dark packs that you can access. Accursed Cultist with the Dark Commune could be used to flood the board with a bunch of bodies that regenerate. Warp Talons are nice, maybe with the Mark of Slanesh to get them some sustained hits goodness and advance and charge if they need it. Possessed I think are kind of fine with their devastating wound things. Terminators are usable enough. And again they've got access to Nurglings for secondaries if you want to throw in a bit of Nurgle shenanigans there. 35 points for pop-up secondary doers is rather nice, or they could screen and infiltrate. For weaknesses for a top army played well, I feel like there's not all that much there. If you can catch up with them and deal damage to their units directly, maybe they're not the most awesome for durability. They tend to be a lot more damage dealers rather than big tough tanky units, though for a lot of important things you might not be able to shoot them if the Chaos player has command points and Mark of Nurgle units. I guess they are a little bit reliant on command points to access some of their best tricks as well, I suppose. Overall, though, it seems to be a very good time to be a Black Crusader. I have a feeling that Chaos Space Marines are probably in the place where they're sufficiently strong that they are going to attract Games Workshop's attention for further nerfs. Wouldn't be too surprised if they fiddle around with the points a bit on things like Chosen or maybe their strong firepower units once more if they are choosing to leave the Dark Pacts where they are. Finally, and perhaps to not many people's surprise, and the strongest faction of Warhammer 40k 10th edition up to this point are the Aeldari, holding steady over win rates of around about 58%, taking down 23 big tournaments since the balanced data slate, and currently the single most popular played faction in competitive events. That one definitely is kind of telling, given that they're definitely not the most popular faction in the game in terms of the amount of people collecting them. I think they'd be around about top 10, but certainly not first. Basically, Aeldari are still reigning supreme. Games Workshop are almost certainly going to hit them with further nerfs in the January balance update as a result. For strong units, they still have a fairly spectacular array of good options, though maybe some things like the Wraith Knight and the D-Cannon batteries not being quite as big staples as they were at the start of the edition, perhaps particularly given the changes to Overwatch and the way that devastating wounds work. Just for a few of their strong options though, Night Spinners are excellent for slowing down enemy units, as well as dealing some pinpoint devastating wound damage where needed. Wraith Guards with Spirit Seers often tend to be moving up to a midfield point to hold the position against all comers and have some really quite interesting movement support options. Fate's Messenger can be pretty big on the Spirit Seer for extra damage and durability, plus their normal reviving a model rule. Warp Spiders and Shadow Spectres are just horrible movement units that can jump around the board with a lot of freedom, bully lighter enemy objective scorers, and achieve secondary objectives with their speed. Battle Host rerolls still make their anti-tank weapons truly monstrous, with things like Fire Prisms and War Walkers being very efficient and very reliable dealers of damage there. The Incarn and the Avatar are both really tough. The Avatar just loads of raw might and can be interesting enough even for automatic hits Overwatch if you plug in a Strands of Fate dice to the Wailing Doom, and the Incarn's got its disruptive teleport around the board to get where it needs to or get out of trouble. Then for characters, the Autarch Wayleaper can farm command points. Farseers have nice Fate dice manipulation, plus bonus special rules for buffing other units. Fugan's nice enough and is often used on his own. And there's other interesting lone operative shooting options like the Death Jester, maybe with Fate's Messenger, and Illic plus Rangers. Strands of Fate and Battle Host both provide a lot of just easy raw damage. Strands of Fate particularly nice for interacting with things like Devastating Wounds and Overwatch. Even with a change to Devastating Wounds, it can still be big against vehicles and things. Phantasm is still enormously powerful on the infantry, and they've got plenty of other movement shenanigans stratagems in the battle host to confound and outmaneuver the foe with their already fast units. Overall, it's clearly all still very much coming together for the Aeldari against the vast majority of foes out there. By all metrics, they are still pretty much the faction to beat in Warhammer 40k, though certainly since the fairly big points increases that Games Workshop hit them with last time, their win rate dropped by a pretty crazy amount, going down over 10%, which will be utterly devastating to most factions. Perhaps biggest weaknesses are they're just not really all that tough for the cost due to those points increases. Every unit very much does feel like it's valuable, and losing anything is going to hurt a fair bit. And it's maybe only the Wraith Guard and the Avatars that are really happy soaking up loads of damage. Perhaps the things that seem to do best against them are things that move very fast and tend to be able to get around the board quickly to hit them in the backfield. It looks like their worst matchups tend to be things like Genestealer Cults, Orks and Grey Knights, fairly capable of jumping around and keeping up pressure from unexpected angles, and perhaps have some damage profiles that are quite nice at dealing with the most of the slightly more fragile Aeldari units. Looks like we're still in for a couple of months worth of Space Elf domination though, but for Aeldari players out there, I'd expect a decent amount of units on this list probably to go up in points further in the balanced data slate update, unless they decide that the best way to address the faction is to change some of their standard rules instead. I guess we'll wait and see. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a quick run through 10 of the strongest factions in Warhammer 40k and a few things that make them strong currently. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. How have you been finding playing with or against these factions? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.